When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, America fell on hard times. Many people were jobless, homeless, or hungry. For some, there was no escape from the misery, but for those with a dime to spare, relief could be found at the movies.
I remember going in for a dime or 6 cents one time, and we'd see the movie about 2 or 3. Sometimes we stayed there from the beginning till the last. We see it 3 times.
Whether it was horror, comedy, mystery, or gangsters, Depression-era audiences flocked to the theaters, developing another new national pastime. Millions of Americans lost themselves in spectacle or indulged their fascination with the rich and powerful. The Depression fed the growth of the American film industry for many years. It also inspired filmmakers to explore the suffering, the courage, the frustration, and the desperation of Americans who lived through it.
The trouble with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy.
The central principle of capitalism is to be one step ahead of everyone else, to be the first to buy a stock that you think may ultimately appreciate in value, and then as others buy more and more of it, the price of that stock will realize a profit. To be the first to sell a highly priced stock before everyone else gets nervous and starts to dump their stock and the price comes down. In that case, you would lose your money if you weren't one step ahead of the herd. This is exactly what happens in October of 1929. Kind of panic sets in.
In a little over a month, between September and October 1929, the U.S. stock market first slid, then crashed, causing economic disaster for investors, banks, and businesses.
By the last week of October, there are a series of massive trading days where stock values start to plummet. This triggers the Great Depression itself, one, because so many people lose their savings and their accumulated funds literally overnight. So when people lose all of this money, they start to buy less and less in the marketplace, obviously, and that further depresses the sales and the profitability of firms. The second reason this triggers a Great Depression, as we call it, is that as the stock market collapses, investors become much more pessimistic about the future. So even those investors who have some money on hand will sit back and say, well, I'm not going to invest now. And as more and more investors hold back this way, it only accelerates the process of collapse.
Many observers believed the effects of the crash would be short-lived and the economy would recover quickly. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, it became clear that the nation had entered an unprecedented economic depression.
This was both the deepest depression in American history and the longest in duration. And in some ways, it's the first economic crisis that this country faced when it was fully in the industrial era. And it's more vulnerable to this kind of shock than a less fully developed economy was earlier.
Can't get no way, can't draw no pay. Unemployment getting worse every day. Nothing to eat, no place to sleep. All night long, folks walking the street. Doggone, the panic is on.
Bad policies on the part of banking, business, and government greatly helped not only to cause the Depression, but to prolong it.
When the value of stocks collapsed, banks lost their money. That's bad enough, but it wasn't just their money they were losing. It was the money of their depositors. So this is the cause of what's referred to as the great bank panics of the early 1930s, where people would rush to the bank in fear that their savings literally were gone. In many cases, they were. There were in the United States in the 1920s 25,000 banks.
25,000 different banking corporations doing business, some of them doing business in areas no larger than a single county. So banks didn't have the resources and the reserves to weather a storm like this.
Some of the causes of the Depression were inherent in the nature of laissez-faire industrial capitalism itself. New technologies and management techniques had resulted in dramatic increases in productivity, which caused the supply of goods to greatly exceed demand. In order to remain profitable, many businesses had to cut jobs and wages.
The distribution of wealth and incomes was becoming increasingly unequal. There are a variety of reasons for this. One of them has to do with severe hardship in the agricultural sectors of the economy. Inadequate rainfall, drought, bad harvests. Some of it had to do with the impacts of mechanization and technological change that grew out of World War I. Finally, in the industrial areas, wages were not keeping up with profits. Now, by the time of the stock market crash in the fall of 1929, consumer spending was already weakened in the economy because consumers couldn't keep up the rate of growth in their spending on goods and services. When sales decline, profitability declines. And when profitability declines, you have the ingredients of a collapse, of a depression.
The Great Depression wasn't limited to the United States.
The Depression has to be understood as a global event. And many of the countries affected responded in a kind of reflex way by trying to protect themselves from the shocks that were roiling through the international system as a whole, by throwing up great, huge protective tariff barriers around their economies so that they could keep whatever business there was at home. In country after country, in the United Kingdom, and France, and Germany, the United States, Japan, all of them reverted to these protectionist and economically isolationist policies when the shock of the Depression happened. And in fact, that response helped both deepen and prolong the Depression.
The Hoover administration took some steps to mitigate the effects of the Depression, but they were too slow and too small to halt the rapidly spreading crisis. Hindsight is 20/20, but at the time, the Hoover administration did not fully grasp the scope of the problem.
The government, in fact, did not regularly compile things like unemployment statistics, so nobody knew for sure just exactly how big this crisis was. Now, it turns out by 1932-33, we think the unemployment numbers go up to about 13 million people, 1 out of every 4 workers. But nobody could really see that clearly because the data gathering services weren't there to report on it.
We have done all we can do. There is nothing more to be done.
Hoover's approach to the mass poverty of the Depression was to leave it to state and local authorities to deal with the problem. But states and towns were quickly overwhelmed by the thousands of unemployed, homeless, and hungry citizens.
To a degree, what Hoover was counting on was voluntarism. He really did think that church groups, that the local governments, that the state governments would rise to the occasion and take care of this extreme poverty created by the Depression. And it didn't work. He took the action that economists later said was correct to shore up the basic banking, credit, and financial system of the country. He did take that action. But the one component that was missing was this direct relief component. And it's because he believed in this voluntarism, and he was very disappointed in Americans, never really quite comprehending the severity of that depression on them and the impact that it was going to have on their ability to volunteer or to take care of themselves.
I've been having a hard time, a hard time. I've been having a hard, old hard time. Every day's just the same, naughty nickel to my name. I've been having a hard time and a hard time.
During the Depression, Dad was unable to get work. He was living off of our Depression stipend. Mother, being the seamstress, had a shop down on Granville Street here in Chicago. And people from the hotel next door knew about it. They'd come in and they'd say, "Oh, I saw the most wonderful film last night with Carol Lombard, and she had a wonderful gown. Would you make me a gown like that?" At any rate, that's how she brought us through the Depression.
Things were very, very poor in our part of South Dakota. I mean, families didn't have enough to eat. There are 2 or 3 families that gave children away so that the children would have a better home. The government had virtually no programs to feed people or anything.
It was pretty hard. It was less so for my mother and dad because my dad had a job with the oil company and they were able to eat. I don't think they had much in the way of luxuries or anything like that, but they were able to go through it.
I used to ask my grandmother when I was a child how the Depression affected them. And she said, well, we were always so poor, it didn't matter. You know, she said they always had their own farms and their gardens and cows and chickens and pigs. So they were pretty self-sufficient.
My husband was born and raised in San Francisco, Chinatown, and he had a big family, and he was the 7th child. And so during the Depression years, he remembers being the family scrounger. You know, when people throw away fish heads and fish parts and chicken parts in the produce markets down there that they didn't want anymore, people were allowed to go through and pick out what they wanted.
They would trim the greens, like cauliflowers, and I would pick up the trimmings, and that would be our vegetables. And then they would have 50-gallon barrels where they would throw the chicken, duck, and turkey feet. And we would take those home, and Mom would make that into a edible version of snacks. And that's how we got some of our protein. And then I would go down and ask the butcher for beef liver or pork liver or whatever kind of liver they had free for the cats. To save face, the butcher never asked you how many cats you had. They knew how many kids there were in the Fung family, so they would give you a big chunk of liver, knowing that you don't have a cat. But it's only in retrospect that I can say that they were hard and difficult times, but we didn't realize it at that time because we were all in the same circumstance.
It was tough for my father. He would go to the farmer's market around 3 o'clock in the morning and see where he could buy the cheapest amount of potatoes or onions or apples or whatever that he could sell. I had my own push cart, and I would go with my father. When he got his stuff, I would get something, and then I'd make my own display, and we had enough. As kids, we ate everything on the table. We never left anything over. And if one of us left something over, somebody else would grab it and finish it.
The inability to find work and to support their families drove some men to abandon their homes and travel across the country by rail, looking for work or handouts. Few women rode the rails. In fact, one writer found it hard to explain how women survived at all.
It's one of the great mysteries of the city, where women go when they are out of work and hungry. There are not many women in the bread line.
Americans found many creative ways to make do during the Depression. They patched shoes with cardboard and made clothes out of flour sacks.
Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, after seeing so many of your pictures in the magazines and papers, and seeing that you always look so well dressed, a thought came to me that you may have a few old, discarded dresses that you would like to get rid of. I can sew, and would only be too glad to take 2 old things and put them together and make a new one.
African Americans who lived through the Depression experienced the same hardships as whites, and often worse. But for many blacks, poverty and hunger were nothing new.
The Negro was born in Depression. It only became official when it hit the white man.
I got to keep moving, I got to keep moving. Blues falling down like hail.
In the 1920s, still better than 80% of all African Americans still lived in the 11 states of the former Confederacy in the South. The South was the nation's most agricultural region, which meant it was the poorest region. In those northern cities where blacks had migrated, particularly during and immediately after World War I, they were typically last hired and first fired, so black unemployment rates were considerably higher than white unemployment rates.
The Depression affected Mexican Americans in unique ways. In the wake of civil war in Mexico and economic opportunity in America, immigrants had poured northward across the border during the 1920s. Unrestricted by the National Origins Act, as many as 500,000 had moved to the United States in this period.
A vast number of them were employed in agriculture. These were the jobs that nobody else wanted. Picking cotton in the Southwest, picking grapefruit, lemons, sugar beets. And when the Depression came, the Mexican origin population was displaced from those low-skilled occupations by migrating Okies and whites coming into the Southwest. And one of the responses by the American government was to find a way to send back individuals who were not considered Americans. And we really don't know the numbers of how many were actually repatriated, but most estimates indicate anywhere between 350,000 and 500,000. A good proportion of those were American citizens. That is, they were individuals who were born in this country. And suddenly they were picked up, discouraged from staying here, and sent back to Mexico, to a country they did not know.
Many Americans who lived through the Depression experienced financial hardship, unemployment, hunger, or homelessness. But for many, the most profound effects were psychological.
The psychological response of the unemployed worker, the male head of household, was to feel ashamed of himself and to feel guilty and to feel that he personally had let down his family, disappointed himself, and that he took onto himself a burden of personal guilt. What we have to infer from this is that so deeply ingrained in the American DNA was the notion that we are the captains of our own destiny, the masters of our own fate, that if we flop, it's nobody's fault but our own. This is, you might say, the dark underside of the vaunted American value of individualism.
Hoover is my shepherd, I am in want. He maketh me to lie down on park benches, he leadeth me by still factories. He restoreth my doubt in the Republican Party. He guideth me in the path of the unemployed for his party's sake.
Many Americans blamed President Herbert Hoover for their problems. His inadequate, seemingly callous response made him an object of criticism and even derision.
Any president is blamed for a downturn in the economy if it occurs on his watch. And Hoover was simply the victim of that. He didn't cause the Great Depression. But because of his own personality, he just looked like he was indifferent and didn't care. He was a terribly asocial person, very unemotional in public, unable to express his sympathy for anyone, rich or poor.
Yea, though I walk through the alley of soup kitchens, I am hungry. I do not fear evil, for thou art against me.
The desire to relieve their situation drove many citizens to direct action. They marched, they protested, they joined political movements or created movements of their own. Between 1930 and 1933, the country erupted in dozens of displays of public unrest.
The Ford Hunger March, which takes place in March of 1932, it's not organized by a union. It's organized by various radical groups. The communists were parts of it, the socialists, the sort of just a general kind of unemployed councils in Detroit. And they march on the Ford Motor Company, not on City Hall, not on the federal government building. They march on the Ford Motor Company. And what were the demands? Well, the workers were met with gunfire, with water cannons, with actually a kind of persecution after the march. 4 were killed, and Ford, the sort of the icon and symbol of successful capitalism, was discredited. The old order, the old elites, the old way of doing things was not providing the answers. They had before, but now they were not.
7-cent cotton and 40-cent meat. How in the world can a poor man eat? Flour up high and cotton down low. How in the world can we raise the dough?
Fatting our hogs, taking to town. All we get 6 cents a pound. Very next day we have to buy it back. 40 cents a pound in a paper sack.
The paradox of hunger in a land of plenty led farmers to create a resistance movement of their own. Unable to sell their produce at a price that would sustain them, farmers tried various ways to influence the market and to resist the power held over them by creditors. Depression-era Americans quickly found that individualism had its limitations. There was strength in numbers. Thousands of citizens who had lost faith in their government turned to organizations that put their stock in the power of collective action. Unions, farmers' associations, socialist and even communist groups attracted Americans who felt exploited by their superiors and betrayed by their leaders.
More than 25,000 American citizens have journeyed all the way from Pittsburgh to Washington to ask for the right to work.
The hardship of the Great Depression provoked, in certain countries, extreme political responses to the crisis, extreme policies to try and solve the crisis. We have the example of what was called National Socialism, or Nazism, in Germany, and the emergence or the rejuvenation of various socialist and communist movements throughout Europe. We also have the rise of fascist movements in Italy and Spain, in Great Britain, even in the United States. There was a small fascist movement that felt that fascism, the sort of authoritarian control of politics and economy by the state, would provide a solution.
The most dramatic challenge to the American government came not from communists or political agitators, but from a ragtag army of former soldiers called the Bonus Marchers.
We're all the way from Oregon, parlez-vous. To get some cash from Washington, parlez-vous. You're going to see a better day when Mr. Hoover says, okay, hinky-dinky parlez-vous.
What the Bonus Marchers wanted was the premature payment of a bonus that they'd been promised, actual cash payment that they'd been promised in return as a thank you for their service in the military in World War I. And this payment was due to be made in 1945. They wanted it now because they needed the cash, they said, not unreasonably.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
3 cheers for the bonus that we're going to get.
Hoover said, no, we have to pay you when the time comes, and that's 13, 14 years from now. You got to wait.
I never saw such fine Americanism.
No, they didn't want to wait.
As exhibited by you people. You have just as much right to have a lobby.
Hoover asked General Douglas MacArthur to lead a force to aid the Washington, D.C. police to remove the Bonus Marchers from these buildings and drive them back to their Anacostia Flats in Washington, where they had this so-called encampment. MacArthur exceeded his orders very dramatically. Not only drove the marchers out of the buildings and back to Anacostia Flats, but then he put their camp to the torch. Now, for reasons that aren't altogether clear, Hoover never publicly took MacArthur to task for this, and Hoover took onto himself the responsibility for this action, which was politically pretty nearly fatal. I mean, there's probably no single event in 1932 that was better utilized to symbolize Hoover's alleged callousness and indifference to the plight of the unemployed than the fate of the Bonus Marchers.
By 1932, many Americans were dissatisfied with the federal government and ready for a change. President Hoover was widely disliked, but the violent repression of the Bonus Army finished him politically. That fall, a majority of voters would look to new leadership to take action where Hoover had fallen short.
This is the 4th show in 2 months that I've been in of and out of. They close before they open. The Depression, Derek.
Don't know why. There's no
The Great Depression left its impression on American culture in music, films, and the visual arts. It also left its impression on the collective consciousness of a people who had been taught to believe that hard work and self-reliance were the only keys to success. Americans learned a bitter truth from the Depression, one that would inspire them to demand more from their government and their employers in the future.
I think the generation that came of age during the Great Depression was deeply affected by the experience of the Depression, the hardship of the Depression, the uncertainty and fear that it provoked.
There had been extreme poverty in the United States since the beginning of the country. But what the Depression did was to bring in a whole other group of people into that poverty level or into that poverty status. And that's the group then who began to demand direct relief from the government.
They looked, as they had always done, to an awful lot of places for help. They looked to each other, they looked to their extended families, but in this emergency, extended families couldn't bear that burden. They looked to their churches, the way people had always done. Churches couldn't bear that burden. They looked to local relief, the way they had often done. They looked to self-help organizations, the way they'd always done. But it was literally the collapse of the American economy. The Great Depression is nothing less than the collapse of the American economy. And the traditional sources of aid failed them. And that's what turned them to looking for the federal government to help.